When we talk of saints, we tend to think of people as this kind of finished product that has this kind of seal of approval from the church. I kind of prefer to look at people as walking the path of holiness.
Saints are often portrayed as perfect individuals who conquer their passions and live selfless lives devoted to God. So are the saints really as distant from us as we think? Or is it time to reevaluate our understanding of holiness? Award-winning author Robert Ellsberg has compiled an eclectic cloud of witnesses, past and present, that challenges us to do just that. The communion of saints is much bigger than we think, thanks to Blessed Among Us, day by day with saintly witnesses, today on Subject Matters. Robert, welcome to Subject Matters. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you very much.
This is such a great book that you've written. It's a daily reader of the lives of many different saintly people, as you would say. And it's really a joint project that you did with Liturgical Press. So let's start there. How did this come about?
About 6 years ago, they approached me and said that they were developing a new prayer resource that came to be called Give Us This Day. And they had the idea that every day there would be an entry on a saint or holy person. And they wanted it to follow the inspiration behind an earlier book I'd done called All Saints, in which it took a kind of Catholic perspective on holy lives, but it wasn't confined to officially canonized people, and included potential candidates for canonization, like a Dorothy Day or Oscar Romero, for instance, but also people outside the traditional list of saints, artists and peacemakers and spiritual explorers. And so they wanted that kind of sensibility there, and that would be a kind of a branding tool also for the journal, to give people a sense of what the sensibility of it was, that it was a Catholic journal that was kind of open to a wider audience.
And I think that's one of the most popular segments of the Give Us This Day book, right? I think a lot of people, I'm talking to the people at Lit Press, they say they get a lot of positive feedback.
Well, you open it up and your eyes not necessarily going to fall on the gospel text of the day or the liturgical readings, but people are very interested to see who is the saint of the day.
Yeah.
And I think people look forward to that as a kind of surprise.
Now, this is not your first book on saints. You're also the author of All Saints, Daily Reflections on Saints, Prophets, and Witnesses for Our Time. So this is somewhat of a hobby for you, you could say, but when did you become interested in the lives of the saints?
I think it goes way back in my life. I remember when I was in high school and I first came upon the Little Flowers of St. Francis, and I became aware of this reality of these kind of extraordinary people who were in some way in their own time kind of reflected the gospel through their lives and the way they lived. But all my life I've been interested in, drawn and attracted to kind of great souls, great hearts, moral witnesses, and how they taught me and inspired me. So that led into my writing the first book 20 years ago, All Saints. And I've really never stopped since then, kind of being a collector of these stories, a teller of these tales.
Right. And let's look a little bit at the structure of the book itself. I mean, how does it work? Because I think you have 2 saints per day for an entire calendar year, correct?
Well, I've been writing these for 6 years, so I've written about 1,000 of them. So the idea was to have a daily collection, and they're relatively short, so not just 1 but 2 per day. So whatever that adds up to, about 730.
One of the things I really love about this book is the balance and the variety. You mentioned that you were kind of pushing the boundaries a little bit by including people that are not, officially canonized in the Catholic Church, but you have a balance between men and women. You have people from every period of history, including some Old Testament figures. You have laity, you have clergy, you have religious, and you have, and I personally love this, a ton of people that I'd never heard of.
Yeah,
that's
right.
great. And then there's, just the diverse backgrounds. I'm just going to list here some of the people that you talk about. Galileo, Flannery O'Connor, Gandhi, Ruth and Naomi, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Dorothy Day, Chief Seattle, Mozart, Oscar Romero, Rosa Parks. So you have Catholics, you have other Christians, you have Jews, Hindus, First Nations people, artists, poets, philosophers, social activists, reformers, even some heretics I caught in there, at least at the time, at the time, right? But that's what's really unique about this compilation, you know, that it goes beyond the official kind of communion of saints that we think about as Catholics. So what prompted you to do that?
Well, I think we have a tendency to think of holy people as people from long ago. Our images are formed by stained glass windows or holy cards. We think of them as perfect people. We think of them as some living in some kind of religious zone, and so many of them were priests or nuns or monks that they can also seem very remote from the experience of ordinary lay people who make up and always have the vast majority of the people of God. So I, on the one hand, wanted to show the saints somewhat a little bit in their context, how they responded to the challenges of their own time. But I also wanted to expand the kind of idea of holiness, so that it's something that we can identify with a little bit, because after all, the saints are not just people for us from long ago to venerate, but they're models for us in inspiring us on our own path to holiness.
Yeah, and it's really a challenge, I feel like, to our way of thinking, our mentality about the saints, if you will. Do you think that people, generally speaking, have too narrow of an understanding of holiness?
I think that we focus so much on the kind of criteria of canonization, which involves sort of orthodoxy and often the certification of miracles. We think of them as heavenly patrons or kind of wonder workers. Or they were close to God, but not exactly human. But of course, before St. Francis was St. Francis, he was just Francis, the son of a cloth merchant in Assisi, and all of these saints started with one step somewhere. And if we could identify a little bit more with what was that kind of voice that called them to go deeper and to go farther, and to realize that that's a call that's addressed to all of us as those who walk on the path of Jesus.
It's such a diverse group, as I mentioned. Is there something that they all have in common? I mean, have you discovered a kind of new or a contemporary definition of holiness that you think can apply to all the different people?
Well, again, when we talk of saints, we tend to think of people as this kind of finished product that has this kind of seal of approval from the church. I kind of prefer to look at people as walking the path of holiness. And if we think of it that way, we have a better sense of what unites us with the saints rather than the gulf that separates us. And so all of these people were people who responded to a call, a voice that they heard. They responded to that and they gave it everything. And sometimes in outlandish and eccentric kinds of ways, sometimes working with their own limited, personalities, their defects, their flaws. They were not perfect people. And I think we can learn to look at them more as friends and companions.
We have to take a short break, but when we come back, we'll look at a couple of the figures that we find in Blessed Among Us. More right after this. Robert Ellsberg is editor-in-chief and publisher of Orbis Books, the publishing arm of Maryknoll. He's the son of U.S. military analyst and whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg, who in 1971 released the infamous Pentagon Papers. From 1976 to 78, Robert worked for the Catholic Worker in New York, where he met Dorothy Day, whose cause for sainthood is now open and is featured in Blessed Among Us. During the Korean War, a woman correspondent happened upon a clinic in Busan where she found a nun on her knees cleaning a gangrenous sore on a man's leg. "Sister," she said, "I wouldn't do that for $1 million." "Neither would I," the sister replied. That story, told of Sister Mercy Hirschbeck, Maryknoll's first sister doctor, made headlines around the world. Most of her life was spent out of the limelight. Well, we're here with Robert Ellsberg discussing his really wonderful book, Blessed Among Us. And Robert, I want to talk to you a little bit about Dorothy Day, servant of God, Dorothy Day, who we read about on November 29th, which is the day she died back in 1980. She was an American laywoman, co-founder of the Catholic Worker, a convert to Catholicism, a peace advocate, really an embodiment of Catholic social teaching before its time, someone who worked on the margins. And her cause for sainthood is open, obviously. Perhaps it's only a matter of time now before it's official. But you knew Dorothy. You worked with her, you've written extensively about her life, you've edited some of her writings. And I'm just wondering, how did her life and work influence your understanding of a saintly witness of holiness?
Well, it goes back to your question earlier, how did I get into all of this? And really, I have to give a lot of credit to Dorothy Day, whom I met when I was 19. I had the chance to work with her for the last 5 years of her life. I wasn't a Catholic at the time. I became a Catholic after that period. I was attracted initially by her courageous peace witness. She'd been arrested many times for protests over the years, and her consistent witness in living among the poor. But it took a while for me to really understand the faith that underlay that. And a lot of that was sustained by her devotion to the saints. She saw them as not just sort of an anecdote from church history, but as a real model and inspiration in her own life. And she also spoke all the time about the fact that the vocation of all Christians is to be a saint. She's often quoted as saying, "Don't call me a saint, I don't want to be dismissed that easily."
Right.
Maybe she said that one time, and it's the most famous thing that anybody knows about her. But by that she meant she didn't want to be put on a pedestal. She didn't want people to think, oh, Dorothy Day can do those kinds of things because she's a saint. She really believed that saints were those who reminded us of why we're Christians and what it means to be a Christian. And so from her, I kind of picked up some of that interest in saints, but also the kind of eclectic cloud of witnesses that she drew on, which included writers like Dostoevsky and philosophers and peace activists and people like Gandhi. So I think that's the sensibility that I carried into my later work.
Mm-hmm. I want to quote you here, an article that you wrote in May 2015 for the Catholic Worker. You were talking about your opinion on Dorothy Day's canonization, and you said, "Some worry that in making Dorothy Day a saint, the Church will turn her into a pious cutout," as you mentioned, "shorn of her prophetic and radical edges, or use her to promote some agenda that was not her own. Others question the investment of resources that might better be used for the poor. Still others feel that the whole process violates her own wishes," as you just mentioned to us. After all, didn't she say, "Don't call me a saint"? So you understand these concerns, but you really believe that she is a saint and should be officially recognized by the Catholic Church as a saint. How come?
Well, I think that the canonized saints, first of all, are only a very small number of the total number of holy people. It's a very select group. And most of those models of saints tend to be, to conform to certain kind of stereotypical images that people have of priests or nuns or monks, bishops, that sort of thing. To have an example like Dorothy Day that opens up a model for lay people, a person who followed her own conscience in the gospel, to live out her faith in a way that was really far in advance of anything that the church was teaching at the time, who lived a kind of marginal life, and yet now I think is seen very much as a kind of saint for our time. One of the things that Dorothy said when she looked at the saints in her youth, she said it was wonderful to see so many saints who cared for the lepers and the sick and the poor. She said, but where were the saints to change the social order? Where were the saints to do away with slavery, not just to minister to the slaves? It was a kind of question that she answered with her own life. And because of Dorothy Day, we wouldn't have to ask that question anymore. Where are the saints that change the social order? I think we need to, when we add new saints like that, we enlarge our sense of moral imagination of what's possible and what's demanded of us in our own time. So I think that she, with all the issues we face now of war and peace, desecration of creation, a lot of the agenda that Pope Francis has raised, I think Dorothy Day is very much a saint for our time.
Yeah, very prophetic life and voice, undoubtedly. I would like to talk to you about Daria Donnelly. We read about her on September 22nd in your book, and I'm just going to read an excerpt here of what you write about her. You say, "The calendar of saints offers scant attention to those who lived out their faith in the context of ordinary family life. Daria Donnelly, a young laywoman from Cambridge, a wife and mother of 2 children, whose life was cut short by multiple myeloma, represents a kind of faithful witness lived out, as she put it, amid the noise, the joy, the distraction of family life that leaves no great monument in the world. And yet who can say that she did not exemplify as much as any great saint, the real vocation of the Christian, to embrace God's love and reflect it back to the world. Now, I know that Daria was a very dear person to you. Tell me a little bit about her.
She was my son's godmother, and I included her story, a longer version of that, in a book I wrote on women saints called Blessed Among All Women, which I was writing at the time when she was dying. And when I described the book I was writing, and she was also a fan of my earlier book on All Saints, she said, "It's great that you write about people like Thomas Merton and Henry Nouwen, but where are the saint fathers, the saint mothers?" She said the church kind of tends to ignore that whole dimension of reality, and yet those great saints, they experienced a certain dimension of life, but they weren't attuned to all that chaos and disorder and distraction and all the joy and grief that comes with ordinary family life. The fact that she was writing that to me as she herself was dying, and she had 2 young children, spoke to me very deeply. And she was a very devout Catholic, but she demonstrated to me that that's not just a matter of going to church on Sundays and following the rules. It was really a matter of the way that her life was regulated by the gospel, and it gave a meaning to her life and a meaning to her death. And I thought, well, that's all we're called to do. We're not called to be canonized saints. We're called to follow faithfully. And it's interesting that story was, I'm touched that of all the 1,000 people or whatever I've written about, that you picked on that one. And so many other people have too, because in a way we can still, these canonized saints, we can tend to think of them as these heroic figures. But we all know people in our own lives who just demonstrate a kind of quiet courage and faith in the way that they deal with the challenges and the struggles of ordinary life. And I think it's important that we remember that that's a dimension of the communion of saints, the larger part.
We have a guest reviewer today, as always. Father Christopher Jameson is a Benedictine monk, the former abbot of Worth Abbey in England. Father Christopher.
Blessed Among Us is a treasure trove of holy lives with famous jewels and hidden gems. There are classic lives of the saints, but what makes this book special is that alongside those, there are stories of unknown heroes and heroines. For example, the frankly bizarre life of Mother Antonia Brenner, who was twice divorced, had 7 children, gave herself over to prison ministry, and ended up living in a prison cell. Well, the way the book works is the well-established one of a calendar of the saints from the calendar of the church, and you can look up any day you want to find that classic saint. But alongside those, you'll find Robert Ellsberg has presented some wonderful alternative saints of the day who, of course, are not canonized. And some of these are unknown, such as the mothers of the disappeared in Argentina, or others are people who'll be known to us, but who we've never really thought of as holy, such as the composer Mozart. I suppose we've all been excessively affected by the film or the play Amadeus, where he comes across as a really bad boy. Well, Ellsberg presents him as a holy composer of sublime music. Then, of course, the pairings that emerge from this, you can see that on any day there are 2 saints, and one is a famous saint, Pope Saint Callistus, for example, but alongside him is President Julius Nyerere. Or on another day, we have the glorious pairing of Saint Thomas Aquinas and Dostoevsky. I wonder which one has brought more people to God through their writing. Now, the book is beautifully presented, as you can see, with a calendar at the back where you can look up the day that you want, or you can look up the individual saint you want. It's got a great apparatus. And it's drawn from the saints and their blessed ones found in Give Us This Day, Liturgical Press's daily prayer book, which is so popular. So my question to Robert Ellsberg is, how did you choose the uncanonized saints? Did you have a process of canonization of your own?
Okay, thank you very much, Father Christopher. Robert, did you have your own canonization process for the men and women that you chose in your book?
Not so much a process, but maybe a set of criteria. I think I was influenced a lot by a statement by Simone Weil, the French philosopher, who said it's not enough to have saints, but we must have the saintliness demanded of the present moment. So I kind of, instead of just beginning with the canonized saints and then explaining why they're important, I also have in the back of my mind, what are the kind of questions, the spiritual challenges of our time? I think, one of those, as we mentioned, is the need for more lay people, people who represent a spirituality not just of fleeing the world and that kind of asceticism, but of kind of engagement. I think figures like Dorothy Day, who combine the works of mercy and charity with struggle to change social structures, those who promote peace, those who encounter other religions and cultures in a spirit of hospitality. I think those are some of the kind of questions or the criteria. But I think that I go back, and it's reflected in the title of my column and of the book, Blessed Among Us. I begin with the criteria that Jesus set of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor in spirit, the pure of heart, the peacemakers. Those are not exactly the criteria of official canonization, but I think that they speak to the kind of spirit that unifies a lot of the figures that I've included in this book.
I was touched too in the introduction. I think you mentioned the story of the Good Samaritan, which is sort of there's an outsider who chooses to act in a very kind of saintly way, if you will, and it's a model from Jesus himself to say, look, sometimes the people that you think are always in the inn are not necessarily the ones that exercise love or practice love in the way that I'm talking about doing it. It's very powerful.
Well, the kind of inspiration of Dorothy Day and the Catholic Worker was the text in the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus says, talks about how our salvation hinges on, did we give a drink of water to someone who was thirsty? Those kind of the works of mercy as a kind of criteria for, holiness, if you want to say, rather than much more kind of doctrinal or stereotypical kinds of image of holiness that we try to squeeze people into.
We have to take one more break, but when we come back, some concluding remarks from Robert Ellsberg. Don't go anywhere. Blessed Among Us, Day by Day with Saintly Witnesses, is published by Liturgical Press and is available for purchase at litpress.org and at Ben McNally Books in Toronto. Also by Robert Ellsberg, All Saints, Daily Reflections on Saints, Prophets, and Witnesses for Our Time. Regardless of whether we are priests, nuns, or lay people, regardless of whether we are celibate or married, of exceptional abilities or completely average, there is a path to holiness that takes account of our particular gifts and duties in life. A path that is different for each one of us. Robert, there's a very interesting connection between a lot of the saints, and that's they read about each other, they tend to be inspired by each other. I'm thinking of St. Augustine reading the life of St. Anthony, for example. What do you make of that? That this seems to be, there's a kind of a thread running through a lot of the lives of the saints.
I think there is a kind of chain reaction in a lot of cases. It's one thing to read the gospel, it's one thing to read a book on ethics or theology or something, but to see how faith is lived out in a concrete life and to think, gosh, I could do that as well. That's exactly the kind of reaction that St. Augustine had when he was wavering over his own conversion. He came upon the life of St. Anthony, this famous desert father, and he was amazed to think that not just that St. Anthony had done what he was wavering, over doing, but that the idea that God was doing these things in our own time. It was not just in ancient Bible times, even though he was in the early centuries of the church. And you see that so often in the lives of the saints, how perhaps kind of one lights another. I mean, St. Ignatius, the founder of the Jesuits, his conversion began when he was convalescing from a war injury, and he had nothing to read but the lives of the saints. And he began to, have a whole different idea of what it meant to be a heroic, soldier of Christ. What would it be like if I lived like St. Francis or St. Dominic? Or the followers of St. Francis, who encountered a saint in their own time. His example was inspiring to them. He seemed to be alive. He seemed to have some kind of secret of happiness, and they wanted to be around him. They wanted to follow him and take some of that in. It doesn't have to be somebody you knew. I was happy to meet Dorothy Day, but many of the people who've affected me or expanded my kind of, moral possibilities are people I read about, like Blessed Franz Jägerstätter. He was an Austrian peasant who was beheaded by the Nazis. He was the only Catholic layperson beheaded for refusing to take an oath to serve in Hitler's army. He was completely alone. His priest and his bishop advised him to go along, and yet his conscience told him to do otherwise. He heard a voice that seemingly nobody else in his time could hear. But because his story was preserved and has been told, the rest of us can hear that voice too. And we can look at someone like Blessed Franz and think, what if I were to do that? Or what is the kind of challenge? What's the voice that's speaking to me from the needs of my time?
The greatest saints are often very conscious of their imperfections or their sinfulness. So I was going to ask you, how do you understand this kind of very real dynamic between, holiness on the one hand, but the reality of sinfulness, of being imperfect, being a human being?
Well, fortunately, that's kind of inscribed right in the foundational texts of our faith in the gospel. You see a great saint like St. Peter, who betrays the Lord, 3 times, stumbles over and over again, but keeps on persisting, is not defeated by that, doesn't become hopeless, doesn't give up on himself. He experiences forgiveness. I mean, the Pope's motto is actually, refers to that idea of being forgiven, being seen and forgiven. And I think that the saints did not indulge themselves by just dwelling on their limitations. They knew that God saw them as they were, but called them to do their best and to be faithful. And so I think it's important that we know about the humanity of the saints, because otherwise it lets us off the hook if we think, well, I could never do that. Because look at St. Peter, who said, "Leave me, Lord, I'm a sinful man." As if you really knew who I was, if you knew what you're working with, you'd find a better candidate to be the rock on which you build your church. But the idea that then Jesus does see us, God does see us, knows what we're made of, but we're not defined by our limitations. We're perhaps defined by our possibilities and our potential for faithfulness.
Very quickly, I must ask you this: do you have a favorite saint?
Well, I have a lot of saints. Some help me to pray better, some of them to be more faithful, some to be more joyful. I think the person who's really played a big role in my life is Blessed Charles de Foucauld, a French nobleman who underwent a dramatic conversion and set out to imitate Jesus in his hidden life by living in the North African desert as a hermit and trying to be a brother to his Muslim neighbors, and said that we have to proclaim the gospel not just with our words but with our lives. And in his kind of solitary witness, very unappreciated in his time, is a great inspiration to me.
Well, Robert, thank you very much. It's a wonderful book, and you've done us all a great service by compiling this eclectic group of saintly people. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
The book is Blessed Among Us, Day by Day with Saintly Witnesses by Robert Ellsberg. He's the editor-in-chief and publisher of Orbis Books. You can get it right here at Ben McNally Books in Toronto, or from our good friends at Liturgical Press. Just visit litpress.org. If you want to learn more about Orbis Books and browse their catalog, you can visit their website, orbisbooks.com. I want to thank our guest reviewer today, Father Christopher Jameson. He's a Benedictine monk and the former abbot at Worth Abbey in England. He's also the author of Finding Sanctuary, Monastic Steps for Everyday Life, also published by Liturgical Press. And remember, if you would like to see my video review of Blessed Among Us, visit our website, saltandlighttv.org/subject matters. Thanks for joining us today. We'll see you again next time. Subject Matters with Sebastian Gomes is sponsored by the Cullen family. Our Salt and Light team works hard to bring you quality Catholic programming like Subject Matters. Please consider supporting our mission by making a donation today. Thank you for your generosity. Remember, our hope begins with you.